Hello, my dear friends. In the medieval world, a wedding was not mainly about romance or personal choice. It was about family, land, and survival. Marriage joined two households together, and this union mattered to entire villages, not just to the bride and groom. A wedding was a public event because it changed the balance of work, property, and loyalty. When two people married, their families became tied by duty as much as by blood. In this way, weddings were less about love and more about order. Most marriages were arranged. Parents and relatives discussed the match long before the bride and groom had much to say. They looked at land, animals, tools, and reputation. A good marriage meant stronger fields, safer borders between farms, and better chances of survival during hard seasons. A poor marriage meant conflict and hunger. Because of this, weddings were planned carefully, often when the couple was still young. Love was expected to grow later, after duty was fulfilled. The bride and groom usually met only a few times before the wedding day. Sometimes they did not meet at all until the ceremony itself. The bride was often in her early teens. The groom was usually a few years older. Childhood ended quickly in medieval life, and marriage marked the beginning of adult responsibility. From that day forward, the couple was expected to work, produce children, and support their families. Before the wedding, there was an agreement called a contract. This contract decided what the bride would bring into the marriage and what the groom's family would provide in return. This could include land, animals, clothing, or tools. These items were not gifts. They were part of a serious exchange. Marriage was also an economic deal. It protected families from loss and strengthened their future. The church played a central role in weddings. By the later Middle Ages, marriage was seen as a sacred bond blessed by God. The ceremony usually took place outside the church door or just inside it. This allowed the community to witness the union. The priest asked simple questions. The couple promised loyalty and obedience. Rings were sometimes used, but not always. The most important part was spoken words. Once said, the marriage was believed to be unbreakable. Clothing for weddings was not always white or special. Most people wore their best everyday clothes. The bride might wear a dress of wool or linen, sometimes dyed in bright colors if the family could afford it. Blue and red were popular. White did not become common until much later. Flowers were worn in hair or carried in hands to show fertility and new beginnings. These small decorations gave beauty to a life that was usually plain. Food was one of the most important parts of a wedding. Even poor families tried to provide a feast. Bread, cheese, and ale were common. If the family was wealthy, meat was served. Roasted birds, pork, or beef filled large wooden tables. Guests brought food as gifts. Eating together was part of the promise of shared life. The feast showed that the new household would not starve. Music and dancing followed the meal. Simple instruments like flutes, drums, and stringed tools filled the air. People danced in circles and lines. Songs told stories of work, harvest, and faith. Laughter was allowed on this day. Weddings were one of the few times when the hard routine of medieval life paused for joy. Even so, order remained important. Elders watched behavior. Drinking was allowed, but fights were not. The wedding night carried great meaning. It was believed to complete the marriage. In some places, family members escorted the couple to their bed. This was not done to embarrass them, but to prove the union had begun. Curtains were drawn, and the household waited quietly outside. This moment showed that the marriage was real and not just words spoken before the priest. For the bride, marriage meant leaving her family and joining her husband's household. She became part of his family's work and rules. Her days would be filled with cooking, cleaning, spinning thread, and raising children. Her value was measured by her labor and her ability to produce heirs. For the groom, marriage meant taking responsibility for land and family honor. He was expected to protect and provide. Divorce was rare and difficult. Marriage was seen as permanent. Only the church could allow separation, and this was uncommon. A bad marriage was endured rather than ended. This made the wedding day even more serious. It was not just a celebration. It was a life decision with no easy return. In villages, weddings were remembered for years. People spoke of the feast, the music, and the match between families. These memories became part of local history. A wedding marked time. People remembered births, deaths, and marriages as the main events of life. And so, a medieval wedding was not only a personal moment, it was a public agreement, a religious bond, and an economic exchange. It joined land to land, family to family, and future to future. Love might come later, or it might not. What mattered first was survival and order. As this first part of our slow walk through medieval weddings comes to rest, we can already see that these ceremonies were built on duty more than dreams. They were not shaped by choice, but by custom. And in this world, a wedding was not the start of romance, but the beginning of work, family, and lifelong obligation. As preparations continued after the marriage contract was agreed, the whole village slowly became involved in the coming wedding. A marriage was never a private matter. It affected land, work, and family ties, so neighbors watched closely. Women helped the bride prepare her clothing and hair. Men discussed the joining of farms and fields. Elders spoke about whether the match was wise. In this way, a wedding began long before the ceremony itself, growing quietly inside the daily life of the community. The days before the wedding were filled with small rituals. The bride spent more time with her mother and older women of the household, learning what her new life would demand. She was taught how to manage food, how to obey her husband's family, and how to care for children. These lessons were not gentle advice. They were serious instructions for survival. Marriage meant leaving one world and entering another. The bride's home prepared her to belong somewhere else. The groom's household also prepared. Extra food was stored. Benches and tables were borrowed. The house was cleaned as well as possible. In wealthier families, new bedding or furniture was made. These objects were signs of a new beginning. A wedding was not only about joining two people, but about building a new working unit inside the village. On the wedding day, people gathered early. Bells rang to call the community. The bride walked from her family's home to the church or meeting place. This walk itself was symbolic. It showed that she was leaving one household and moving toward another. Friends walked with her. Songs were sometimes sung along the way. Flowers and branches were carried to mark the path. The groom waited near the church door, surrounded by his family and neighbors. The ceremony itself was short and simple. The priest asked the couple to speak their vows clearly so all could hear. These words were the true heart of the wedding. Once spoken, The couple was married in the eyes of God and the community. There were no long speeches or decorations. What mattered was that witnesses were present. Marriage had to be public so no one could deny it later. After the ceremony, the group returned to the groom's home or to a shared space for the feast. This was often the largest meal the family had served in months. Bread was cut in thick pieces. Ale was poured into wooden cups. Meat was brought out if it could be afforded. Guests did not sit quietly. They talked, laughed, and sometimes sang. For one day, worry about work and hunger was pushed aside. Games and dances followed the meal. Simple circle dances filled the yard or the road outside the house. Children ran between adults. Musicians played flutes or small drums. These sounds marked the wedding as different from ordinary days. Life in the Middle Ages was heavy with labor, and a wedding allowed a rare pause. It reminded people that joy still existed within duty. As evening came, attention turned to the new couple. The bride was led to the groom's house, sometimes with torches lighting the way. This walk showed that she now belonged to his family. The bed was prepared by older women. Sheets were spread carefully. In some places, witnesses were expected to see the couple lie down, not for shame, but to confirm that the marriage had begun fully. After this moment, the household slowly became quiet. Guests returned home. Fires burned low. The wedding day ended not with fireworks or speeches, but with sleep and silence. The next morning, work would begin again. Fields still needed tending. Animals still needed feeding. Life did not stop for marriage. Marriage became part of life. For the bride, this first morning as a wife was important. She rose early to help in the household. Her actions showed her willingness to serve her new family. For the groom, the day showed his new role as head of his own small unit within the village. From this moment forward, their lives were tied to one another not only in name but in labor. Weddings also changed how people were treated by others. A married man was trusted more than a single one. A married woman was judged by how well she kept her home. Marriage brought status, but also pressure. The community watched closely to see if the union worked. A failed marriage meant shame for both families. In this way, a medieval wedding was not just one day of celebration. It was the start of a new role inside a strict world. It joined two people, but it also joined work, land, and future children. Every smile and every song carried the weight of survival behind it. And as this second part of our quiet journey through medieval weddings comes to rest, we see that these ceremonies were shaped by the needs of the village more than the wishes of the heart. A wedding was a doorway into duty. It was a moment when childhood ended and responsibility began. The feast faded, the music stopped, but the bond remained, lasting not just for love, but for life. As the first excitement of the wedding day faded, the true meaning of marriage slowly settled into everyday life. In medieval times, marriage was not judged by how happy the couple looked at the feast, but by how well they worked together afterward. The village watched closely. Neighbors noticed whether the new wife rose early, whether the new husband kept order in his home, and whether their household blended smoothly into the rhythm of the community. Marriage was not private. It was something that could be seen and measured by others. The bride's change in status was immediate. She no longer belonged to her father's house. She belonged to her husband's family. This meant new rules, new authority, and new expectations. Her mother-in-law often became her teacher and her judge. She learned how food was prepared in this household, how cloth was woven, and how animals were cared for. Even small differences in custom mattered. A different way of baking bread or storing grain could cause quiet tension. The bride's task was to adapt, not to change the system. The groom also felt the weight of marriage in practical ways. If he was young, he might still live under his father's roof, but now he carried responsibility for another person. If he had his own land, he now worked it not only for himself, but for a growing family. His strength and planning decided whether his household would survive winter. Marriage made him fully part of adult society, with duties that could not be avoided. Children were expected soon after marriage. In medieval belief, a successful marriage produced heirs. A wife who did not become pregnant quickly could be whispered about. People questioned her health or her virtue. A husband without children was seen as unlucky or weak. Birth was dangerous, and many women died young, but the pressure to have children never disappeared. A wedding was understood as the beginning of a line that must continue. Weddings also marked class and wealth clearly. Poor couples married simply with little food and few guests. Wealthy families held large feasts and invited many people. In noble families, weddings could last for days. Music played constantly. Tables were filled with meat, pies, and wine. Gifts of land and titles were exchanged. These marriages were political. They joined families to gain power, not only to form households. In noble weddings, clothing became more important. Brides wore rich fabrics like silk or velvet if they could afford them. Jewels and crowns of flowers were placed on their heads. These clothes showed the strength of the family rather than the beauty of the bride. The groom wore bright colors and belts with metal designs. Every detail sent a message about status and alliance. The church continued to shape the meaning of marriage. Priests taught that marriage was sacred and permanent. This belief made separation rare and difficult. Even when couples argued or suffered, they were expected to remain together. Marriage became a test of patience rather than happiness. Endurance was praised more than affection. Songs and stories of the time reflected this view. Tales spoke of loyal wives and hard-working husbands. Love appeared as duty fulfilled, not as passion felt. Romance existed, but it was not the foundation of marriage. Stability was. A good marriage was one that did not disturb the village. Season also affected weddings. Many took place after harvest when food was available. Winter weddings were harder, with less to eat and more cold to face. Spring weddings meant new beginnings, but also more work. Each season shaped the celebration and the future of the couple. Over time, wedding customs became fixed traditions. Certain words had to be spoken. Certain walks had to be taken. Certain foods had to be served. These customs gave people comfort because they were familiar. A wedding looked much like the weddings before it. This sameness made the union feel strong and accepted. So, as this third part of our slow walk through medieval weddings comes to rest, we see that marriage was not only an event, but a change of identity. A bride became a wife. A groom became a head of household. The community gained a new working unit. A wedding was less about the couple's feelings and more about the future of families and fields. The music faded, the guests returned home, and the new couple stood quietly inside their shared life. From this moment forward, their days were shaped by work, children, and custom. The wedding itself was brief. The marriage that followed was long, steady, and demanding, built not on dreams alone but on duty and survival. As married life continued, the meaning of the wedding reached far beyond the couple themselves and settled into the wider village. Every marriage shifted the balance of work and duty. Fields were now shared differently. Animals were moved between households. Food was cooked for more mouths. The wedding had quietly reshaped the daily map of the community. People noticed these changes and adjusted their own routines around them. In this way, a single marriage touched many lives. For the bride, daily life became a test of learning and endurance. She woke before sunrise to light fires, prepare simple meals, and begin spinning or weaving. She carried water, swept floors, and helped with animals if the family owned them. Her movements were watched, not only by her husband's family but by neighbors as well. A hard-working wife brought honor to her husband's household. A lazy or disobedient wife brought shame. This judgment was not spoken loudly, but it spread quietly through glances and whispers. The groom's role also grew heavier. He was expected to protect his wife, provide food, and answer to village leaders. If taxes were owed, his name was written down. If labor was demanded by the Lord, his body was taken. Marriage placed him fully under the law and customs of men. A single man could move lightly through life. A married man carried weight. In noble families, the pressure was even stronger. A noble wedding could decide the future of whole regions. Land passed from one family to another through marriage. Old feuds could end or begin with a single union. A bride in a noble house did not simply become a wife. She became a living agreement between families. Her behavior reflected not only on her husband, but on her parents and ancestors. Every step she took was watched for meaning. Gifts played an important role in weddings. Guests brought bread, cloth, animals, or tools. These gifts were not only kindness, they were support for the new household. A young couple needed everything, from pots to blankets. The community helped them begin. In return, the couple owed loyalty and help in the future. A wedding strengthened the net of giving and receiving that held village life together. Music and stories continued long after the wedding feast ended. People spoke of who danced well, who drank too much, and who gave the best gift. These memories became part of local history. A wedding was one of the few times when people allowed themselves to remember joy instead of only work. Yet even joy had its limits. The next day always brought labor back into place. Marriage also changed how a person was judged by God. The church taught that marriage protected people from sin. A married man and woman were seen as safer from temptation. This belief added another reason to marry young. A wedding was not only for family and land, it was for the soul. To live outside marriage was seen as risky and improper for most people. Women carried the heavier burden of this belief. Their bodies became closely tied to honor. A wife was expected to be faithful and quiet. A husband was expected to be firm and guiding. These roles were taught in sermons and stories. A good marriage was one where each person stayed within their place. Happiness was less important than order. Seasonal life shaped married life as well. In spring and summer, work in the fields filled every hour. In winter, families stayed close to the fire, mending tools and telling stories. Marriage meant sharing this rhythm with another person. It meant facing hunger, cold, and sickness together. The wedding promised companionship, but it also promised shared hardship. If a marriage failed in behavior, not in law, the village felt it quickly. A fighting couple disturbed neighbors. A man who beat his wife too openly drew attention. A woman who argued loudly brought shame. Elders stepped in to restore calm. They did not usually seek fairness. They sought quiet. Peace mattered more than justice. So as this part of our story settles into calm reflection, we can see that medieval weddings were not bright moments standing alone. They were doorways into a long life shaped by custom, labor, and belief. The ceremony passed in a day. The consequences lasted forever. The bride's wreath withered. The feast was forgotten. But the bond remained, tying two people into the hard and steady path of medieval life. In this world, a wedding was not a promise of romance. It was a promise of work, family, and survival, spoken aloud in front of God and neighbors and carried quietly into every ordinary day that followed. As married life continued beyond the first weeks, the meaning of the wedding slowly changed from celebration into responsibility. The community no longer saw the couple as newly joined, but as another working household within the village. Their value was measured by how well they fit into the shared rhythm of labor and duty. A strong marriage meant steady work, healthy children, and quiet behavior. A troubled marriage meant whispers, concern, and sometimes vmesh interference from elders. The bride's identity continued to shift. Her name was spoken less than her role. She was known as a wife before she was known as herself. Her days were filled with tasks that supported the household. Grinding grain, baking bread, washing clothes, caring for animals, and keeping the fire alive were not small chores. They were the foundation of survival. A wedding did not remove hardship from her life. It changed the shape of it. What she once did for her parents, she now did for her husband's family. In many regions, the bride brought with her a dowry. This could be cloth, coins, animals, or land. These items were meant to protect her in her new home. If her husband died, this dowry could support her. In practice, however, control of these goods often passed into her husband's hands. The dowry showed that marriage was not only emotional, but deeply economic. It tied wealth to womanhood and duty to property. For the groom, marriage marked the moment when he became fully visible to the law. Taxes were counted in his name. Labor service was demanded from his body. If his household failed, he answered for it. His wedding day was the day he became responsible not only for himself, but for another life and for future children. This weight was not spoken of during the feast, but it was understood by all. In noble households, weddings were surrounded by ceremony and display, but the purpose remained the same. A noble bride was taught how to manage servants, oversee storage rooms, and guard family honor. Her behavior affected political relationships. A careless word could harm an alliance. A public argument could weaken trust between houses. Even her clothing and posture carried meaning. She became part of a living agreement between families. The church continued to guide married behavior. Priests preached about obedience, patience, and faithfulness. Marriage was described as a path of discipline rather than pleasure. Husbands were told to lead. Wives were told to follow. These lessons were repeated so often that they became part of daily thought. A wedding was not the start of freedom. It was the beginning of a new kind of restraint. Songs and sayings reinforced these ideas. Stories praised wives who endured hardship quietly, and husbands who worked without complaint. Love was shown through duty rather than words. A woman who cooked well and bore children was praised more than one who spoke sweetly. A man who kept his field strong was valued more than one who wrote poems. Marriage was judged by usefulness. Time also reshaped the memory of the wedding itself. The bright moment of the feast faded into routine. The music became a story told later. The clothing was worn again as everyday dress. What remained was the bond between two lives tied together. A wedding did not change the world around the couple. It placed them deeper inside it. If children came, the marriage was seen as successful. Babies were welcomed as signs of blessing. They were baptized quickly to protect their souls. Their birth strengthened the family's place in the village. If children did not come, fear and blame followed. People whispered about curses or hidden sin. The marriage itself was questioned, even if nothing had changed in behavior. Season by season, the married couple learned to move together. Spring brought planting. Summer brought long days in the fields. Autumn brought harvest and storage. Winter brought cold and hunger. Marriage meant facing each season side by side. The wedding promised this shared path, not comfort. So, as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that marriage was not a single event but a lifelong adjustment. The ceremony opened a door, but the true journey happened afterward. A wedding was the beginning of duty lived out in small actions every day. The candles of the feast were long burned out. The songs were quiet. But the marriage remained, steady and demanding, shaping the lives of two people and the future of their families. In this world, a wedding was not about choosing happiness. It was about learning how to endure together within the hard and ordered life of the Middle Ages. As the marriage settled deeper into ordinary life, the memory of the wedding slowly turned into a quiet marker of belonging. The couple was no longer seen as newly joined, but as part of the village structure itself. Their home became another place where bread was baked, children were raised, and tools were stored. The wedding had moved from a public promise into a private routine. In medieval life, this shift mattered more than the feast or the vows. It showed that the marriage was working, that the bond had become useful to the community. The bride's daily path became steady and predictable. Each morning followed the same pattern. Fires were lit, water was carried, grain was ground, and cloth was mended. These actions were not seen as small. They were the quiet work that kept families alive. A wedding meant that this work now served a new household. Her labor was watched and judged, not only by her husband's family, but by neighbors who measured households by order and calm. A well-kept home meant a strong marriage. A messy home suggested trouble. The groom's role also became more fixed. He was now counted as a full worker in the village economy. If a bridge needed repair or a field needed clearing for the Lord, his name appeared on the list. Marriage placed him firmly inside the chain of duty that linked land, labor, and authority. His wedding day marked the moment when his life stopped being his alone and became part of a larger system of responsibility. In noble families, the shape of married life looked different but followed the same meaning. A noble bride learned how to direct servants, manage stores of food, and represent her family in public. She was expected to show calm behavior and controlled speech. Her wedding joined two houses, and her daily actions kept that bond alive. The groom learned how to manage land and command loyalty. Their marriage was not only personal, it was political, and it was watched by many eyes. Across all classes, the church continued to shape how marriage was understood. Priests taught that marriage created a single body out of two people. They spoke of unity, patience, and sacrifice. A wedding was described as a holy doorway into a life of shared struggle. Pleasure was allowed, but it was not the center. Order and faith were the center. This teaching gave meaning to hardship. When couples faced hunger or illness, they were told that marriage was the place where such trials should be endured together. Community memory also played a role. People remembered which families joined through which wedding. Old alliances were recalled by name. New bonds were tested through daily cooperation. If two families quarreled, the marriage between them became strained. If they worked well together, the marriage grew stronger in meaning. A wedding connected not just two people, but two lines of history inside the village. Festivals that came after the wedding showed this change clearly. The couple no longer stood at the center of attention. They stood among others. Their place in dances and prayers was no longer special. They had become ordinary again, and in medieval life, ordinary meant accepted. The wedding had done its work by placing them inside the pattern of shared days and shared seasons. Over time, the memory of the wedding feast turned into a story told in winter evenings. People spoke of who sang, who stumbled, who gave the best gift. These stories softened with each telling. What remained sharp was not the joy, but the fact that the marriage had lasted. Longevity became the true sign of a good wedding. A marriage that endured years of work and children and hunger was seen as stronger than one that began with bright music. If trouble entered the marriage, the village noticed. A wife who ran back to her parents brought shame to both houses. A husband who failed to feed his family brought doubt upon his name. Elders and relatives stepped in to correct behavior. They did not speak of happiness. They spoke of balance and peace. Their goal was not to make the couple feel better, but to make the household quiet again. In this way, a medieval wedding did not end when the couple left the feast. It continued in every shared meal, every child born, and every winter survived. The ceremony opened the door, but the life beyond it was long and narrow. Marriage was not an escape from hardship. It was a way to face hardship together. So as this part of our slow journey through medieval weddings continues, we see that these unions were built on rhythm and repetition rather than excitement. The music faded, but the work remained. The vows were spoken once, but duty was repeated every day. In a world shaped by labor and belief, a wedding was not the start of romance. It was the moment when two people were woven into the long fabric of village life, thread by thread, season by season. As years passed after the wedding day, the bond between husband and wife became less about ceremony and more about shared survival. In medieval life, time tested marriages through hunger, illness, and hard labor. A good marriage was not judged by smiles or gentle words, but by whether the household remained steady. Did the fire stay lit in winter? Did the children grow strong enough to work? Did the fields produce enough grain? These were the true measures of a union. The wife's role became deeply tied to the rhythm of the home. She knew where every tool was kept and how much grain remained in storage. She controlled the fire, the bread, and the clothing. These were not small powers. In a world where one mistake could mean hunger, her daily choices shaped the future of the family. A wedding placed this responsibility on her shoulders. And from that moment forward, her labor became part of the village's quiet structure. The husband's role was just as fixed. He worked the land or the craft of his trade and answered to local authority. If taxes were raised or labor was demanded, he was called by name. His marriage meant he was no longer seen as an individual worker, but as the head of a unit. His behavior reflected on his wife and children. If he failed, they suffered. Marriage tied honor and survival together. In noble marriages, this pattern appeared in a larger form. A noble woman managed servants instead of fires and looms. She guarded keys to store rooms and controlled the movement of food and cloth. Her marriage joined lands and titles, but her daily duty kept those lands running. A nobleman guarded borders, attended councils, and commanded soldiers. His wedding tied him into networks of loyalty and rivalry. Even at this level, marriage was less about affection and more about stability. The church continued to watch married life closely. Priests preached about patience and obedience within marriage. A wife was told to endure. A husband was told to guide. These teachings shaped how conflict was handled. Arguments were not meant to break the bond. They were meant to be corrected quietly. Public disorder was seen as dangerous. Elders and priests stepped in when fights became loud, not to find fairness, but to restore calm. Seasonal life pressed on every marriage. In spring, planting demanded long days and aching backs. In summer, harvest and hay filled every hour of light. In autumn, food was stored and tools repaired. In winter, families lived close to the fire and told stories to pass the dark hours. Marriage meant sharing this cycle. It meant facing each season together, again and again, without choice. Children changed the meaning of the wedding even more. With each birth, the marriage became stronger in the eyes of the village. Sons meant future workers. Daughters meant future alliances. A childless marriage caused worry and gossip. People whispered about curses or hidden sin. The wedding that once joined two people was now expected to produce a line that would outlast them. Memory of the wedding itself faded into legend. Old villagers spoke of past weddings as markers of time. They remembered which year a couple married and which winter followed. The feast became a story. The clothes became rags. The vows remained only in the life that followed them. In this way, weddings were not remembered for beauty, but for what they created. If hardship came, such as famine or disease, marriage became a place of shared fear. Husbands and wives buried children together. They rebuilt homes after storms. They stood in church praying for relief. A wedding was supposed to protect against loneliness, but it could not protect against loss. What it did was bind two people to face loss side by side. The village continued to treat marriage as a public matter. Neighbors watched how a wife behaved. They watched how a husband spoke. Their judgments were quiet but constant. A peaceful home meant a good marriage. A loud home meant trouble. Reputation grew slowly just as crops did. A strong marriage built respect over years. So as this part of our calm walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that the true ceremony was not the day itself, but the long life that followed it. A wedding was a doorway into years of work, faith, and endurance. It was not designed to make people happy. It was designed to make families last. The music that once filled the yard was long gone. The flowers had turned to dust. But the marriage remained, shaped by seasons, children, and shared labor. In this world, a wedding was not a bright ending. It was a quiet beginning, carrying two people into the slow and steady path of medieval life. As married life stretched into many years, the meaning of the wedding slowly changed into something quieter and deeper. The village no longer thought about the day when vows were spoken. Instead, it watched how the household survived. A marriage that lasted through hunger, illness, and hard winters was seen as a true success. In medieval thought, endurance mattered more than joy. A couple who stayed together through difficulty showed that their wedding had fulfilled its purpose. The wife's place in the household became more settled with time. She no longer felt like a visitor in her husband's family. She became part of the structure of the home. Her hands shaped the rhythm of daily life. She decided how food was stored, how cloth was used, and how children were guided. Her work was not written down, but it was seen. A strong household reflected her effort. If the home was calm and ordered, people said she was a good wife. If the home was noisy and troubled, they blamed her first. In this way, the wedding placed lasting judgment on her behavior. The husband's place also became fixed. He represented the household in public matters. When the Lord demanded labor or taxes, his name was called. When disputes arose between neighbors, his voice spoke for the family. His marriage meant that he carried not only his own reputation, but that of his wife and children. One careless action could bring shame to many. This pressure shaped how he spoke, worked, and obeyed authority. In noble marriages, this pressure appeared in grander form. A noble woman controlled servants, keys, and stores of food. Her marriage joined families, but her daily duty kept the house running smoothly. She was watched by other noble women, by priests, and by messengers from other lands. Her posture, her clothing, and her speech all carried meaning. A nobleman, tied by marriage to alliances, lived under the same watchful eyes. His union was not only personal, it was political, and his behavior could affect peace or war. The church continued to remind people that marriage was permanent. Sermons spoke of loyalty and patience. A wife was told to endure hardship with silence. A husband was told to guide his household firmly. These teachings shaped how couples saw their struggles. Pain inside marriage was not seen as a reason to leave. It was seen as part of God's design. A wedding was believed to bind two souls as well as two bodies, making separation a danger to both family and faith. Seasonal change continued to shape married life. Spring brought planting and hope. Summer brought long days of labor. Autumn brought harvest and preparation. Winter brought hunger and cold. Marriage meant sharing this cycle again and again. A wedding did not promise ease. It promised companionship in difficulty. When storms came or crops failed, husband and wife faced these fears together, bound by vows spoken years before. Children changed the household even more. With each birth, the wedding gained new meaning. The marriage was no longer only about two people. It became about a line that would continue after them. Sons were trained to work the land. Daughters were trained for future marriages. The wedding that once joined two families now prepared future unions. In this way, marriage became a bridge between past and future. The memory of the wedding feast slowly turned into a story told on long winter nights. Old neighbors spoke of who danced well and who sang loudly. These stories softened with time. What remained clear was not the joy of the day, but the strength of the years that followed. A marriage that survived long seasons of work and loss was praised more than one that began with great celebration. Trouble inside marriage did not remain private. A fighting couple disturbed the village's sense of balance. Elders stepped in to restore quiet. They did not search for happiness. They searched for order. A peaceful home mattered more than a fair one. In this way, marriage belonged to the community as much as to the couple. So the wedding, which once stood at the center of attention, slowly disappeared into daily life. Its words were no longer spoken, but its effects were seen in every meal cooked, every child born, and every field planted. The ceremony had been brief, but the bond shaped years of living. And as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings settles into calm reflection, we see that these unions were not built for romance. They were built for survival, faith, and order. The wedding day passed quickly. The life that followed it was long and demanding. Two people were tied together not by dreams alone, but by work, belief, and the quiet promise to endure the seasons side by side. As married life moved further into the later years, the wedding itself became less a memory of joy and more a marker of belonging. The couple was no longer seen as newly joined, but as an established household within the village. Their marriage was now judged by stability rather than ceremony. Neighbors noticed whether their children were fed, whether their fields were kept in order, and whether their home remained peaceful. In medieval society, this quiet success mattered more than any feast that had once been held. For the wife, age brought deeper responsibility. She no longer learned the rules of the household. She became the one who taught them. Younger women watched how she worked, how she spoke, and how she kept order inside her home. Her marriage placed her into a chain of knowledge passed from one generation of wives to the next. The wedding that once changed her position now made her a guide for others. Her authority grew inside the home, even if her voice remained soft in public. The husband's place also changed with time. As his strength grew and his children began to work beside him, he gained respect among other men. His marriage showed that he could maintain a household and guide a family. This gave him standing in village meetings and labor groups. A man without a stable marriage was seen as uncertain. A man whose household functioned well was trusted more deeply. In noble families, long marriages created strong political roots. A noble couple that remained together for many years represented continuity. Their children became links between powerful houses. Their wedding, once a single event, turned into a lasting alliance. Each year of marriage strengthened the meaning of that union. Even small actions, such as visiting relatives or hosting guests, carried political weight. The church continued to shape how people understood these long marriages. Priests praised endurance more than joy. They spoke of marriage as a cross to be carried with patience. A long marriage was proof of faith. It showed that vows had been kept not only in words but in years of effort. This belief gave meaning to suffering. When couples lost children or faced hunger, their marriage was seen as the place where such pain was meant to be endured together. Memory within the village worked slowly. People remembered weddings by what followed them. They spoke of a marriage that survived famine or one that ended in early death. The ceremony itself faded. The outcome remained. In this way, weddings became part of local history, tied to seasons of hardship and recovery. As age advanced, the wedding bond also changed in feeling. Romance was rarely spoken of. Companionship replaced it. Husband and wife moved together through routine. They shared silence more than conversation. Their lives were shaped by habit. Yet this quiet closeness was its own form of union. The wedding that once joined them now lived inside their shared work and shared memory. When death approached one partner, the marriage was tested one final time. Widows and widowers were treated differently. A widow often returned to her family or lived under the care of her children. A widower might remarry to restore a working household. The original wedding still mattered. It marked the beginning of a life that shaped many others. In noble houses, death changed alliances. A widow might be married again to secure land or peace. Her first wedding remained part of her identity, shaping her value in future matches. Even in death, the wedding bond carried meaning beyond the couple. So as the years passed, medieval weddings revealed their true purpose. They were not designed to create moments of beauty alone. They were designed to create lasting structures of work, belief, and family. A wedding was a doorway into time itself. It joined not only two people but past and future through children and memory. And as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings comes to rest, we see that the ceremony was only the beginning. What mattered more was the life that grew out of it. The music faded, the food was eaten, and the guests returned home. But the marriage remained, moving quietly through seasons of labor and faith, shaping the lives of those who followed. As the final years of a marriage approached, the meaning of the wedding changed once more, becoming less about beginnings and more about endurance. The couple no longer remembered the ceremony clearly. What they remembered were the seasons they had survived together. Their wedding became a quiet point in the past, almost like a doorway they had walked through long ago, without knowing how far the road beyond it would stretch. The wife, now older, carried deep knowledge of the household. She knew how much grain was needed for winter, which herbs helped with sickness, and how to calm quarrels among children and neighbors. Her marriage had given her authority inside the home, not through command but through experience. Younger women came to her for advice, just as she had once gone to older wives. The wedding that had once placed her under instruction had slowly turned her into a teacher. The husband, shaped by years of work and duty, became a figure of stability. His marriage showed that he had kept a household alive. In village life, this mattered greatly. A man who could not maintain his family was seen as unreliable. A man who had done so for many years earned quiet respect. His wedding was no longer a memory of youth, it was proof of survival. In noble families, long marriages created lasting alliances. A noble couple that stayed united through years of rule became symbols of continuity. Their wedding was remembered not for the feast, but for what followed it. Children born into such unions carried claims to land and title. The marriage that began as an agreement between families became part of the political structure of the region. The church continued to bless long marriages as signs of faith. Priests spoke of couples who stayed together through hunger, loss, and old age as examples to others. They taught that marriage was a path of patience, not pleasure. A long marriage was seen as a sign that vows had been honored in spirit as well as in speech. As time passed, the wedding itself became a story told in fragments. Someone would remember the weather, another would remember the music, another would remember who fell into the fire after drinking too much ale. These details softened with age. What remained clear was that the couple had endured. Their marriage became part of the village's memory, woven into stories of harvests and hard winters. When one partner died, the meaning of the wedding shifted again. For the one left behind, the marriage became memory rather than duty. A widow often returned to her children's homes or to her birth family. A widower often remarried, not for romance, but to restore balance to the household. The wedding that once joined two people now shaped decisions long after one life had ended. Among nobles, death brought new alliances. Widows were often remarried to strengthen political ties. Their first wedding remained part of their identity, shaping how others saw their value and their place in society. Even after death, marriage continued to influence land, power, and family lines. In this way, a medieval wedding reached far beyond the day of the ceremony. It touched birth, work, aging, and death. It shaped how people were seen and how they lived. It was not a moment of escape from hardship. It was a promise to face hardship together. So, as this long journey through medieval weddings settles into quiet reflection, we can see that these ceremonies were not built for beauty alone. They were built to hold families together in a hard world. The feast passed quickly. The vows were spoken once. But the bond created by the wedding moved slowly through time, shaping lives in silence. The church bells that rang on the wedding day faded into memory. The flowers dried and turned to dust. Yet the marriage remained, carried forward in children, work, and shared years. In medieval life, a wedding was not the bright end of a story. It was the beginning of a long, steady path walked together, season after season, until time itself finally closed the door that had once been opened by vows. As the married couple moved fully into old age, the meaning of their wedding shifted again, becoming something almost invisible, yet deeply powerful. The ceremony itself was now far behind them, but its effects remained in every corner of their lives. The home they shared, the children they raised, and the seasons they survived together all traced back to that single public promise made long ago. In medieval thought, a wedding was not only a beginning, it was the root from which an entire life grew. The wife, now elderly, held a respected place inside the household. Her hands no longer worked as fast as they once did, but her knowledge guided everything. She remembered years of hunger and years of plenty. She knew how to stretch food when stores were low and how to prepare for winter when harvests were weak. Younger women listened to her stories and instructions. Her wedding had once placed her under authority. Now it placed her in the position of wisdom. She became a living memory of how marriage should endure. The husband, shaped by decades of labor, carried his wedding not as a memory of joy, but as proof of stability. His marriage showed that he had kept a household alive through storms, disease, and war. Among men of the village, this brought quiet respect. He did not speak of love. He spoke of work, children, and seasons. His wedding became a mark of adulthood that had lasted an entire lifetime. In noble families, long marriages carried even greater weight. A noble couple that remained united for many years represented continuity of power. Their wedding joined houses. Their children strengthened alliances. Their shared rule created peace or tension across regions. The marriage was no longer seen as a personal bond, but as part of political history. The wedding that once joined two individuals now stood as a foundation for future rulers. The church continued to use long marriages as examples of faith, Priests praised couples who stayed together through suffering. They taught that marriage was a holy struggle, not a path of comfort. Old couples sitting side by side in church became symbols of patience and obedience. Their wedding was remembered not for beauty, but for endurance. As time passed, stories of weddings turned into lessons. Elders told young couples about how marriages survived past famines or wars. These stories were not romantic. They were practical. They spoke of sharing bread when there was little, of working through illness, of keeping peace inside the home when fear filled the world outside. The wedding became part of village teaching, not just family memory. When one partner died, the wedding took on its final meaning. For the survivor, the marriage became a long chapter that had closed. A widow was often supported by her children or returned to her birth family. A widower often remarried, not to replace love, but to restore balance to the household. The first wedding still shaped these choices. It marked the life that had been built and the duties that remained. Among nobles, death changed alliances once again. A widow's past marriage affected her value in future matches. Her first wedding continued to influence politics and land even after her husband's death. Marriage, once begun, never truly ended in its effects. In this way, a medieval wedding reached far beyond the couple themselves. It shaped work, memory, and future unions. It touched birth and death, feast and famine. It was not a single day of celebration, but the start of a long path that wound through an entire lifetime. So as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that these ceremonies were built to last, not to shine. They were designed to bind people into the hard structure of medieval life. The vows were brief. The life that followed them was long and demanding. The sound of music faded. The tables were cleared. The guests went home. But the bond created that day remained, quietly shaping every year that followed. In medieval times, a wedding was not meant to be remembered for how beautiful it looked. It was meant to be remembered for how long it lasted and how much it endured. As the long path of married life reached its quiet end, the wedding itself became something distant, almost like a small light far back on the road of memory. What once felt like a great public event was now understood as the first step into a lifetime of shared labor, shared loss, and shared endurance. In medieval life, people did not look back on weddings as moments of romance. They looked back on them as the day when two lives were tied together so that they could face the world as one household instead of two separate ones. For an elderly wife, the wedding day was no longer about flowers or music. It was about everything that followed. It was about the children she had raised, the winters she had survived, and the work she had done beside her husband. Her marriage had shaped her entire identity. She had moved from daughter to bride, from bride to mother, and from mother to elder. Each stage had grown out of that one public promise made long ago. The wedding had not given her comfort. It had given her purpose. For an elderly husband, the wedding stood as proof that he had built something lasting. His fields, his tools, and his children all traced their beginning back to that day. The marriage showed that he had not lived alone or without order. It showed that he had played his role in the village by forming a household and continuing a family line. In medieval thought, this mattered more than personal happiness. A life without marriage was seen as incomplete, but a long marriage was seen as a full life. Among nobles, the meaning of old marriages became part of history itself. A union that had once been arranged for land or peace became remembered for the stability it created. Children born from that marriage inherited titles and lands. Treaties and alliances were remembered through family lines. The wedding that once joined two houses now shaped the future of many people who had never seen the ceremony itself. The church also gave special meaning to long marriages. Priests spoke of them as signs of faith and patience. They taught that a couple who remained together through sickness and loss had honored their vows more deeply than those who only knew easy years. In this way, the wedding was seen not as a single sacred moment, but as a sacred path walked slowly across time. Villages remembered weddings not by how beautiful they were, but by what came after them. People spoke of marriages that survived famine, of couples who raised many children, and of households that stayed peaceful through hard years. The feast and music became small details inside much larger stories of survival. A wedding that led to a strong household was praised long after the day itself was forgotten. When death finally separated husband and wife, the wedding still mattered. It marked the beginning of the life they had shared. For the one left behind, the marriage became memory rather than duty. Yet its influence did not end. Children carried the family name forward. Land passed to new hands. New marriages were arranged that grew out of the old one. The first wedding continued to shape the future even after both bride and groom were gone. So in the medieval world, a wedding was never just a ceremony. It was a doorway into a long chain of work, belief, and family life. It joined not only two people, but two pasts and two futures. It shaped daily routines and long histories. It was not built to be remembered for beauty. It was built to be remembered for endurance. And as our slow walk through medieval weddings finally grows quiet, we can see their true meaning. These weddings were not about romance or personal choice. They were about survival, order, and continuity. The vows were spoken once, but their weight lasted a lifetime. In a world shaped by hard seasons and strong customs, a wedding was not the end of a story. It was the beginning of a long and steady journey through work, faith, and shared years. As the memory of the wedding faded further into the past, what remained was the shape of the life it had created. In medieval villages, people did not measure a marriage by the beauty of the ceremony, but by the quiet strength of the household it produced. A good marriage was one that did not disturb the balance of the community. It did not bring constant quarrels into the street. It did not leave children hungry. It did not create shame between families. In this way, the success of a wedding was judged slowly over many years by the calmness of everyday life. The wife, now fully settled into her role, became part of the hidden structure that held the home together. She knew how much grain must be kept for winter and how much could be shared. She knew which child needed more food and which tool needed repair. These choices were not written down, but they shaped survival. Her wedding had placed her into a system of responsibility that never truly ended. Even when her strength weakened, her knowledge remained part of the household's order. The husband, shaped by time and work, became a steady presence rather than a young laborer. His marriage showed that he had taken his place in the village as a man with duties. He stood among others in church and in the fields not as a youth, but as the head of a family line. His wedding had marked the point when his life became tied to land, children, and reputation. Each year of marriage deepened this tie. In noble houses, the long shadow of a wedding reached even further. A marriage that had once been arranged for land or peace became part of written history. Children born from that union carried claims and names that mattered across regions. The wedding was remembered not for its feast, but for what it created. Castles changed hands. Borders shifted. All of this traced back to a ceremony that had once taken place before an altar. The church continued to frame these long marriages as proof of faith. Priests spoke of couples who remained together as examples of God's will. They said that marriage was not meant to be easy, but meaningful. In this teaching, hardship inside marriage was not a sign of failure. It was a sign of obedience. The wedding became a lesson that was lived rather than taught. Village memory worked in quiet ways. People remembered who married whom and what followed. They spoke of a marriage that brought peace between families or one that ended a long feud. They spoke of unions that survived disease or war. In this way, weddings became markers in local history, tied to events larger than the couple themselves. When children grew and married in turn, the original wedding gained new meaning. It became the root of many households. A single ceremony in the past now explained why certain families worked together and why certain names appeared often in village records. Marriage created lines that spread outward through time. Even when both husband and wife had died, their wedding continued to matter. Their children carried the family land. Their grandchildren carried the family name. New marriages were arranged that rested on the place their union had created. The wedding, once a single day, became a lasting shape inside the life of the village. So as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that these ceremonies were never meant to shine for a moment and disappear. They were meant to grow roots. They joined people not only to each other, but to the long story of their community. The flowers of the wedding day had long turned to dust. The music was forgotten, but the bond remained, visible in work, family, and memory. In the medieval world, a wedding was not something that ended when the feast was over. It was something that quietly continued, shaping lives long after the words of the vows had faded into silence. As generations passed, the meaning of a single wedding became woven into the long memory of the village. People no longer remembered the exact day or the exact words spoken, but they remembered what that marriage had produced. They remembered which families became connected, which fields were worked together, and which children carried the joined bloodlines forward. In this way, a wedding did not belong only to the bride and groom. It belonged to the future of the community itself. The household created by marriage became a small world of its own. Inside it, rules were learned and passed down. Children watched how their parents spoke to one another, how they shared food, and how they handled hardship. The wedding that once joined two people now shaped the behavior of many. A strong marriage taught patience. A troubled marriage taught caution. Either way, its influence reached beyond the couple. For the wife, age brought a new kind of power. She no longer stood only as a worker in the home. She became a keeper of memory. She remembered past winters, past harvests, and past births. Younger women asked her when to plant, how to prepare food for long storage, and how to calm quarrels within the household. Her wedding had placed her into a long chain of women who carried knowledge forward without writing it down. Her voice mattered most inside the home, where survival began. For the husband, time turned effort into reputation. A man who had kept his family fed and his home in order was trusted more deeply by others. When disputes arose, his words carried weight. His marriage showed that he could manage not only land, but people. The wedding that once marked his entrance into adulthood now marked him as someone who had endured. In noble families, this long endurance carried political meaning. A marriage that lasted many years showed stability. Stability meant strength. Allies trusted houses that did not break apart easily. Children from such unions were seen as natural heirs, shaped by both families' traditions. The wedding became part of the story told in records and letters, not as a feast, but as the beginning of a line of rulers and landholders. The church continued to place these long marriages within a sacred story. Priests spoke of old couples as examples of devotion. They said that such unions showed God's order working through human life. Marriage was not described as a path to pleasure, but as a path of discipline. A wedding was the first step onto that path, and every year after it was another step taken in faith. Village life also reflected this belief. People did not expect marriage to remove suffering. They expected it to organize suffering. Hunger, cold, and loss were part of life. Marriage was the place where these hardships were shared. A man did not starve alone. A woman did not grieve alone. The wedding joined their burdens as much as their hopes. When children married in turn, the first wedding gained new importance. It became the root of many branches. The original union explained why certain families gathered together and why certain names were repeated across generations. A wedding that had once seemed small now appeared large when seen through time. Even conflict did not erase its meaning. Arguments between husband and wife or between their families did not cancel the bond. Elders reminded them of their vows. They reminded them of the work and history that had grown from the marriage. The wedding stood as a reason to restore peace rather than to break apart. So as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that these ceremonies were designed not for the moment, but for the years that followed. They were meant to create stability in an uncertain world. The feast passed quickly. The music stopped. But the structure built by the wedding remained. The union of two people became the foundation of work, memory, and future marriages. In the medieval world, a wedding was not a bright ending to youth. It was the beginning of a long role within family and village life, carried forward quietly through time, shaping generations who would never see the day when it all began. As the memory of the wedding stretched far into the past, its meaning no longer lived in the ceremony itself, but in the patterns of daily life it created. In medieval villages, people understood marriage as something that shaped time. It organized the future. Fields were worked by families formed through weddings. Houses were filled with children whose existence traced back to vows spoken years before. A single wedding could quietly shape the next 50 years of work and survival. The household formed by marriage became a place where customs were preserved. Ways of baking bread, storing grain, and caring for animals were passed from parent to child. These habits did not come from books. They came from observation and repetition. The wedding that once joined two adults now joined two lines of knowledge. One family's ways blended with another's, creating a new pattern that would be taught again to the next generation. For the wife, the passing of time changed her role from learner to guardian of tradition. She no longer asked how things should be done. She decided how they would be done. Her marriage had placed her inside a chain of women who shaped the inner life of the home. The wedding gave her a new name and a new position, but the years gave her authority. She became the person who remembered how past winters were survived and how sickness had been treated before. Her voice guided the household in moments of doubt. For the husband, long marriage meant becoming part of the land itself. His name became tied to certain fields and paths. People spoke of him not only as a person but as part of a place. His wedding had fixed him into the village map. He was no longer only a son of his father. He was the head of his own line. The marriage marked the moment when he became a root instead of a branch. In noble families, this sense of roots appeared on a wider scale. A wedding that joined two houses created new lines of inheritance. Children born from such unions carried claims that could affect whole regions. The ceremony itself might be remembered only in records, but its results were seen in who ruled, who paid taxes, and who commanded loyalty. A single marriage could shape the story of a kingdom long after the bride and groom were gone. The church continued to treat long marriages as proof of divine order. Priests spoke of them as signs that God's will could be seen in human life. They taught that the purpose of marriage was not excitement, but steadiness. The wedding was the first step on a road of discipline and faith. Each year of shared hardship was seen as another step taken together under God's watch. Village stories reflected this belief. Elders told young couples about marriages that survived famine or war. These stories were not meant to inspire romance. They were meant to teach endurance. A wedding was presented as a promise to stay, not a promise to feel. The lesson was clear. To marry was to accept a long task, not a short joy. As children grew and married in turn, the first wedding became part of a larger pattern. It explained why certain families worked side by side and why certain names appeared together in church records. The original union became the starting point of many other unions. In this way, one ceremony became the beginning of many stories. Even when conflict entered a marriage, the memory of the wedding remained strong. Elders reminded couples of the vows they had spoken and the families they had joined. The wedding was used as a reason to restore balance rather than to separate. Peace mattered more than personal comfort. A broken household disturbed the village. A repaired one restored order. So the wedding, which had once been marked by food and music, slowly turned into something quieter but stronger. It became a structure rather than a moment. It shaped where people lived, how they worked, and how they were remembered. The day itself passed quickly. The life it created lasted much longer. And as this part of our slow walk through medieval weddings continues, we see that these ceremonies were not designed to shine brightly for a single day. They were designed to hold families together across many years. The vows were spoken once. The meaning of those vows was lived out every morning, every harvest, and every winter that followed. As our long walk through medieval weddings gently comes to its end, the ceremony itself now feels far away, like a bell heard in the distance. What remains close is the life that followed it. In the medieval world, a wedding was never meant to stand alone as a beautiful moment. It was meant to open a long chapter of work, family, and shared endurance. The feast ended in a single day, but the bond created by it shaped many years. The bride and groom who once stood before the church door became elders whose lives were measured not by music or flowers, but by seasons survived. Their wedding was remembered through the children they raised, the fields they worked, and the home they kept together. In village memory, their union became part of the story of the land itself. People did not ask how happy the couple had been on their wedding day. They asked whether their household had lasted, whether their family had grown, and whether peace had remained between them. For women, the wedding had been the doorway into a lifetime of labor and guidance. From young bride to old wife, her role changed with time, but always returned to the home. She carried knowledge from one generation to the next, shaping daily life through quiet work and memory. Her wedding placed her into a chain of women who kept families alive not with words, but with routine and care. For men, the wedding had been the step into full responsibility. It tied them to land, to children, and to duty. Their value was measured not by romance, but by stability. A long marriage showed that they had endured storms, hunger, and loss without breaking their household apart. In medieval thought, this endurance was the true sign of success. Among nobles, the same pattern appeared on a larger stage. Weddings joined houses, shaped borders, and created lines of inheritance. The ceremony itself passed quickly, but its effects could last for centuries. A single marriage could decide who ruled, who paid tribute, and who held power. In this way, even the grandest wedding followed the same rule as the simplest one. Its meaning lived in what came after, not in what happened on the day. The church placed all of this within faith. Marriage was taught as a path of patience rather than pleasure. A wedding was a vow to walk through life together, whatever that life might bring. Hunger, illness, and loss were not signs of failure. They were part of the shared journey. The union of two people was meant to give structure to suffering and order to daily life. Village memory worked quietly around these beliefs. People remembered weddings by their results. They spoke of marriages that survived hard winters and raised many children. They spoke of unions that ended feuds or strengthened families. The feast and the dance became small details inside much larger stories of time and survival. So, in the end, a medieval wedding was not a dream of romance. It was a promise of continuity. It joined two lives so that work could be shared, children could be raised, and the future could be carried forward. It was not designed to make people feel special for one day. It was designed to make families last. And now, as this history settles into quiet reflection, the image of the medieval wedding fades like candlelight at the end of a long evening. The voices grow soft. The tables are cleared. The village returns to its slow rhythm of seasons and labor. What remains is the bond that was formed, moving silently through time in the lives of those who followed. In this world of hard alard and steady custom, a wedding was not the end of youth. It was the beginning of duty, not the start of a fairy tale, but the opening of a long road walked side by side. And with that gentle thought, we let this story rest, leaving the medieval wedding behind us not as a moment of beauty alone, but as a doorway into the long and patient life of the past.